share my screen with you. I want to talk about a few things that have nothing to do with Jude the Obscure today. They're just kind of administrative things that we can catch up on. The first thing I want to talk about is participation in the class. So I usually ask that as many people as possible turn their cameras on. And the reason for this is that it makes me feel like I'm actually talking to someone. I'm used to talking in a classroom and I'm not used to teaching in my office like this. So it's a lot easier for me to see faces. The second reason is just that I know you're there, and I can gauge participation by actually seeing your person. So one of the things that's happened is that a few times I've called on people and there's whose camera isn't on and they don't appear to actually be in the room or not connected somehow. I don't see anything in the chat. They don't answer me. I don't know that they're there. And so I'd like you, I think on your part, I'd like you to keep your camera on if possible. And B, I'm going to start like just calling on people individually and say, hey, what do you think about this? And I'll call you individually. And if you don't answer me and don't put in the chat, hey, I'm sorry, my microphone's broken, or I'm in a crowded house and I can't speak right now, then, if you don't respond to me in some way, I'll just assume you're not there in the class and I'll mark you absent for that day. So that's just the way I'm trying to like make sure people are present, because it would be easy enough to just log into the class, turn your microphone off, turn your camera off, and then take off, and go do your workout or whatever you need to do. I'm just going to kind of do that just to make sure that everybody's there, not to be a jerk, but just to make sure everyone is on board. So it's fair to everyone that the people whose faces are there and are participating, everybody gets their participation grade on that basis. So any questions about cameras, being present during the class, etc.? Okay, all right. So the next thing I want to talk about is the midterm, which I've now graded. And I found it really interesting and kind of a tiny bit perplexing. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'll bring up the midterm. Okay, so the main part, the first part, which was multiple choice, is not a big deal. It was the second part that I found perplexing. And it wasn't your answers I found perplexing. It was the fact that some people seem to run out of time. And this was shocking to me since I gave you 3 days to do it. I didn't understand how you can run out of time when you have 3 days, right? So basically, here were the questions. A couple people, I marked people down a bit for not writing long enough answers because I felt like substance, of course you can't judge substance only on length, but it seemed to me that some of the answers were too cursory and didn't really take into account, especially offering a clear rationale for an answer or citing specific scenes or things where you might explain your answer a little bit better. So there were 3 questions. I would say that 2 of them for me were eye-opening. The first 2, the one about political justice and the second one about character formation, because you guys taught me new ways to think about these texts that I hadn't really thought about before. I tended to have them in my mind a certain way. I read William Godwin's essay on political justice as a graduate student, and I think I just had it in my head in a certain way, and you guys helped me see new ways to understand that or think about that. And similarly with Robert Owen, you guys sort of showed me new things about Owen and even the Oscar Wilde novel. But I'm still perplexed about this business about, I guess your lives are just busy and you thought, oh shoot, that midterm is due on Tuesday. And by the time you got around to start answering it, you're like, wow, these questions are harder than I thought they'd be. And I answered the first one, I'm running out of time. So if you have questions about the grade you received, just contact me and we can talk about it. I tried to grade everybody the same and to grade fairly. If there was a reason why you didn't have time during those three, a legitimate reason, like you were suddenly, diagnosed with COVID, or you were taking care of a sick relative and you couldn't get to the midterm, then you should also get in touch with me and we can talk about that. The good news is that you receive points for every question. And so when you fail, let's say you failed, a couple people did, and they ran out of time. That's what happened. If you failed and you got a certain number of points, those still go to your final points. It's not like the E equals 0 and then you lose 20% of your grade. They still go towards your final points. So you might have failed the midterm and still get a B in the class, no worries, right? Or even an A- or a B+, right? It's possible. Because those points will be added. So there are 15 available points. And if you lose 7, then you failed the exam, but you can still do fine in the class. You could still considerably rock everything else and get an potentially an A-, maybe even an A, I don't know, depending on how things work. So any questions about the final? And again, if this were an in-class final, this would not be a problem. This is a COVID-related thing, but the reason I gave you lots of time, which is the way when I was an undergrad at the institution where I was an undergrad, a lot of times we had take-home midterms. I said final, I mean midterms. A lot of people have take-home midterms and finals, and that's the form that they were. You would just have questions to answer. But any questions or complaints that you want to offer to me now, and or things that are unclear about that? Okay. All right, great. So for the most part, it was really intriguing to read them, and I thought you guys did really well. There were far more A's than any other grade, A's or A-, and then there were some B's and B+, and that's almost it. So everybody that took time did well on it. And I looked cursorily at the first multiple choice point, but I didn't really go over it, if you know what I mean, because I didn't see the point, frankly. You just get the grade that you get. All right, and then the next thing I'll say is has to do with the papers. So it's taking me a bit longer to get the papers graded, which is typical for me. I'm a slow grader of papers, but I promise I will get them. What I'll do is I'll extend the date for your revised papers and a week later. So so if we look at the syllabus right now, the revised papers are due on March 30th. I'll now make them due on April 6th. What I'll try to do is make sure you have a full 2 weeks to revise your paper, okay? Because that seems fair to me. And I just apologize for my slowness. Once again, I've had a little bit of a busy, crazy semester like maybe you have. Okay. Any questions about any of that before we start talking about Jude the Obscure? Okay. Well, I'm super happy to be talking about this book. I don't know if you have this edition. This is the edition that I'm using, so I'll shout out page numbers, but if you have a different edition, I'll also say the part and the chapter number. I sort of start slow, but by Thursday, you'll have to be some good way into the novel. In fact, by Thursday, you should have read up, I think, until page 162. So there's quite a bit of reading now, and I warned you about this, but it's just the way it sort of breaks down. we're going to try to finish the novel in 4 sessions. So, all right, so let's go ahead and start talking about it. So I've already mentioned to you already, and we're familiar with Jude. I mean, we're familiar with Thomas Hardy a little bit from his poetry, right? If you remember the darkling thrush, I leant upon a coppice great gate, the sky was spectre gray, the one that takes place at the beginning of the 20th century. So we know that he's this very dark kind of writer, and he, as you can tell from the book, he continues to be a dark sort of novelist, and this is the darkest of his novels. Originally, when he says, or I read in his biography somewhere, that he had originally came up with the idea for the novel as his very first novel, and nobody liked the idea, so he decided he wasn't going to go through with it. In other words, they didn't like the idea of two illegitimate or not properly married outsiders running around the English countryside with their kids. You won't get to they have kids later. You haven't even met Sue maybe, but anyway, they didn't like the idea of this kind of, they thought it was kind of an immoral kind of concept. So Hardy sort of revised it as his final novel and rethought everything and sort of figured it. And I think the role of Jude as a prospective but tragic scholar, somebody who cannot become a scholar because of his class position, that also evolved over time. So that was not initially in the initial manuscript, which I don't think survives. I think he never did anything with it. So, but when I'm saying originally, then I had the title Simpletons and then Heart's Insurgents. I'm not talking about way back in the 1850s. I'm talking about in the 1890s when he actually publishes the work. But if you remember what I've said about this novel, it was published serially first. So he originally got a contract to publish the chapters in I think a men's magazine or something. So it'd be like publishing in the New Yorker or GQ or something like that, Atlantic Monthly, publishing your novel chapter by chapter, and you read it over whatever 6 months takes to weekly put out the chapters. So when I say originally, I'm really talking about the 1890s here. So the full novel gets published in 1895, but the serialized version, I think, was 1893, something like that. And it had the title The Simpletons, meaning Sue, who you will meet soon, his cousin, whom he's in love with, and Heart's Insurgent, which I think is really interesting title. That I think he liked that title, but he chose Jude the Obscure. So what I sort of thought about when I was writing this out is that by calling it Jude the Obscure, suddenly Sue is nowhere in the title. And I think this is interesting because he continues to refer to it in his journals and his letters as Sue's story. So he kind of falls in love with his female characters. This happens a lot. It happens, I think, in Tess Duberville's and also in Return of the Native. He has a tendency to fall in love with his female characters and to, and here, clearly the smartest, most interesting character is not Jude, who's a little bit, he's wonderful, but a little bit hapless, right? It's Sue. Sue's the real thinker and the real feeling person in the novel. And so I think it's interesting that he, in the final title, sort of just calls it Jude the Obscure. So he puts us in the position of identifying with Jude's struggle to become a scholar rather than the struggle of Sue to become a liberated woman. So it's a strange kind of sideways move in terms of the feminism of the novel. Any questions about anything I've said so far? Does it?
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Are the characters in this book based on like real people?
That's a great question. People believe that that the Jude character, that Hardy really related more. It was the most biographical of the novels, of any of them. He often would think of his ideas as stories. The Sue character could be any number of women, because unfortunately, although Hardy married one woman and stayed with her pretty much his whole, well, her whole life, she died, and then he really came apart when she died. In some ways, he wrote a number of very, very moving poems about her being gone. I don't think she's Sue. Parts of her might be Sue, but I don't think she's Sue. He had all these women proteges who wanted to be writers, who hung out around him once he was famous, and he would go to lunch with them. Sometimes he'd even travel with them. And I don't know whether or not there was anything improper, like it was like a sexual relationship, but it was definitely a kind of weird thing. And they had some of the headstrongness of Sue.
Mm-hmm.
So it's possible that, but definitely I think he wanted to go to, I think part of him wanted to go to Oxford, which is what Christminster represents. He wanted to be more educated, but he had to make a living. And he came from upper working class people, builders. His father was a house builder. And also did.
Perplexing when you said like he fell in love with the character.
Yeah, we'll
That
say
like
that
you
again.
talked about. It's just a bit perplexing when you say that he like fell in love with his character.
Yeah, he fell in
Like,
love with Sue, not with Arabella, for sure. Not the first woman that we meet in the novel. She's a kind of a bit of a flat character. Do you know what I mean? She's not very rounded out. She's just a kind of country girl who just wants what she wants. Yeah, no, I think he falls in love with his characters. I relate to this a little bit when I'm writing about a poet. I will often, in writing a chapter, like a longer piece, I will often find myself thinking like them, wanting to know what they think, so I think it's typical for writers to do this. But that's as much as I can say about it being tied to his own story. The place he comes from is like Mary Green. The place the first place in the story, and he names Jude the name of the town. It was called Frawley's, I don't know, like Frawley's River, Frawley's something, I can't remember right now. And so it becomes Frawley, right? But Mary Green becomes a city. So he changes the names. He even changes the areas of England. In all of his novels, he invents a kind of like fake England, right? In order to sort of disguise things. So yeah, I hope that answered your question. Okay, good. So in his original preface, I'm sorry, this looks a little fuzzy over here. I don't have the greatest copier in the world here at my house. From Hardy's original preface, he says a little bit about what he thinks he wants to do with a novel. He says the novel is addressed by a man himself, like from not from some authorial whatever, but a simple person, to men and women of full age. So in other words, you don't have to let your teenage children read this, like, so, because he got a lot of flack. I mean, people just said this isn't a moral novel, which attempts to deal unaffectedly with the fret and fever, derision and disaster that may press in the wake of the strongest passion known to humanity. To tell without a mincing of words of a deadly war waged between flesh and spirit, and to point to the tragedy of unfulfilled aims. So I like this phrase, the tragedy of unfulfilled aims. And to me, it seemed like a useful thing for us to hold on to, like, Jude wanting to become this thing and not being able to become it. All right, right, so he got a lot of flack, and he continued when he published it. When he published it as as a serial, if I'm not mistaken, you know the way Arabella pretends to get pregnant in order to woo him into marriage? That's not what happens in the original, it's his original idea, but he can't put that in. So he has him trick her in some other has her trick him in some other way, where he makes it less explicit that that's what she's done. And then he puts it back in the novel when he publishes it as a full novel. So that's how careful he had to be of the censors, or else the magazine people wouldn't accept it. And he wouldn't get paid. Okay. So I haven't really gotten to the opening scene, which I'll get to in a minute, but I sort of want to talk about this idea of unfulfilled aims. This is an important kind of motif in English writing. And I've cited a few, this is not the full poem, but I've cited a few quatrains from a famous poem from the 18th century. So written 150 years before Hardy writes this, called Elegy in a Country Churchyard. And the basic, by Thomas Gray, it's a really, really great poem. And the idea of this poem is that walking through a country churchyard, and maybe you've experienced this yourself, like I have. I've there's a churchyard, like an old churchyard in, where is it, in Reynoldsburg or Pinkerington or something, over by a Starbucks there. So the only way I find it, if you put a graveyard around a Starbucks, I'll find it. And I went wandering through there a few times, and you look at the things and you think, who are these people, right? And what Thomas Gray is thinking is that maybe these people could have been great if they had the money and the access. You see what I'm saying? So maybe if they didn't have to work their whole lives as farmers, or as a blacksmith or whatever, they might have been great people. And so he has, these are just some selected stanzas from the middle of the poem. Perhaps in this neglected spot is laid some heart once pregnant with celestial fire, hands on the rod of empire, that the rod of empire might have swayed or waked to ecstasy the living lyre. So maybe they could have been, great politicians or great poets, but knowledge never was available to them, right? So poverty, penury just means poverty, right? Chill penury repressed their noble rage and froze the genial current of the soul. So it's a really interesting thing. And I think that this is a good companion poem. This is a sort of famous stanza here where he says, some village Hamden, that with the dauntless breast, the little tyrant of his fields would stood, some mute inglorious Milton here may rest. So somebody as brilliant as Milton might actually be in this country churchyard, but we would not have known, right? Or some great political leader like Cromwell, right? So I think that's the basic background of the what does he call it again? The tragedy of unfulfilled aims. I think that's one way to understand it. So again, when it comes back to sort of themes, I think here are some basic themes that I want to sort of highlight for us. Class and stigma and kind of darkness or obscurity, right, versus light, like Christminster shines in the darkness, right, out there. And remember, it didn't have electric light. So it wasn't shining with electric lights. It's shining because it has windows that the light would have shined off of and reflected and created a light, which I guess is a true enough thing. If the countryside is flat enough, you could see that. So I'm very interested in this first theme of class, right? And the stigma that goes along with it. Like, if you are of this class, it's not just, if you think about it here, it's not just that people go, oh, you're from Mary Green, you're from some poor town, you can't go to college, you can't become whatever. It's that you internalize that. So the several characters he runs into, like the guy who's driving the coal cart, right? You know, being pulled by horses, he's pulling coal behind him, and Jude says, "Have you ever been to Christminster?" You know, this like 11 or whatever year old boy, "Have you ever been to Christminster?" And he says, yes, I've brought my coal to Christminster. They think much deeper thoughts than we could think, right? So it's internalized. The stigma is internalized. It's not just that we haven't been made, we don't have the books, we haven't been taught, but it's like our brains aren't capable of doing it. That's an internalized stigma. And then there's the structural stigma, which is if you're not from a fancy prep school, you can't actually be admitted. Right. So there's all these different things. There's like all these different layers of stigma. And then there's religion as a theme, both in terms of its ideological force, like the way in which Jude keeps thinking maybe he's sinning by having passions. And Sue keeps correcting correcting from the point of view of the novel, his religiosity. And then there are these rules, right? That you shouldn't do this or you shouldn't do that. So like, it's funny, the one scene that we read here, when he goes walking with Arabella and they end up in, is it Alfrexton? What's the name of that other town? The one that's north of Mary Green, the one he ends up in later. Anyway, they end up there and he says, I'm looking for it, it doesn't matter where it is. They end up in this other town that's very close to Mary Green, and they end up at a public house. And she says, well, maybe we can have some beer. And he says, well, it doesn't seem very good on a Sunday, on a religious day, to be drinking beer in the afternoon, to come someplace to drink beer. And she said, well, we didn't come here to drink beer. We just wound up here. And he goes, oh, yes, good point. Let's have some beer. So it's pretty funny. It's like, it has these rules and they continue to motivate him, but kind of blindly, not thinkingly. He doesn't think, wow, it just sort of happens. And then these are some other themes that will come up later. Intellectualism versus anti-intellectualism, poverty, alcoholism, certainly sexism. I think that Hardy is famous for writing sort of liberated women. His mother, on the one hand, she was very much like his aunt. Is it Aunt Frawley? I can't remember. Yes. And in other ways, she was not. She was more accomplished. She definitely liked poetry, liked music, things like this. And his father was a musician as well as a house builder, and so was Hardy. Okay. So let's go ahead with the beginning of the novel. So turn to book 1, part the first, Mary Green, at Mary Green. And I'll read the first part and then we'll try to address this question of why we begin with the schoolmaster of Phillotson. The schoolmaster was leaving the village and everybody seemed sorry. The miller at Crestcombe lent him the small white tilted cart and horse to carry his goods to the city of his destination, about 20 miles off. Such a vehicle proving of quite sufficient size for the departing teacher's effects. For the schoolhouse had been partly furnished by the managers, and only the cumbersome article possessed by the master, in addition to the packing case of books, was a cottage, and the only one was a cottage piano that he had bought at an auction during the year in which he had thought of learning instrumental music. But the enthusiasm having waned, he had never acquired any skill in playing, and the purchased article had been a perpetual trouble to him ever since in moving house. The rector had gone away for the day, being a man who disliked the sight of changes. He did not mean to return until the evening, when the new school teacher would have arrived and settled in, and everything would be smooth again. The blacksmith, the farm bailiff, and the schoolmaster himself were standing in perplexed attitudes in the parlor before the instrument. The master had remarked that if he had got into the cart, he should know what to do with it on his arrival at Christminster, the city he was bound for, since he was only going into, he would not know what to do with it, since he was only going into temporary lodgings. So he's got this, what I guess you would call it a spinet piano. I've never actually seen one. They might actually be smaller than a spinet. It might be less than 88 keys, right? It might be compressed, but it's just what they call it is a cottage piano, right? So the idea comes, Jude gets the idea that maybe you can store it at my aunt's house in the fuel house, right? Which is where they stored the wood, right? So finally, it says, a proper good notion, says the blacksmith. It was decided that a deputation should wait on the boy's aunt. Deputation just means a kind of a contract or an understanding, right? And ask her if she would house the piano till Mr. Phillotson should send for it. The smith and bailiff started to see about the practicability of the suggested shelter, and the boy and the schoolmaster were left standing alone. Sorry I am going, Jude, asked the latter kindly, and then Jude tears up. And then later we see Jude drawing up the water from the well, right? Because there's no running water, there's no electricity. They're basically cottagers in a very poor area in the mid 19th century. I think that Hardy's remembering partly the way he grew up, had to go and draw the water that you would use that day and bring it every day. So why do you think the novel begins with the schoolmaster instead of with Jude?
I think maybe it's to set the scene a little bit better.
Can you say more about that, Trevor?
I'm trying to think here. To give kind of like a perspective of like what everybody's standing in the book is, in a pretty concise way.
Interesting. So if we're going through the perspective of the schoolmaster, instead of through, let's say, Jude himself, what ends up happening is that we understand an identification with the schoolmaster, who, as you know, himself had these grand designs to become an Oxford dean. Wanted to go to Oxford himself. That's where Christminster is Oxford. Wanted to go to Christminster, become perhaps a teacher or a clergy person himself. So that's good. So seeing it through the perspective of the schoolmaster allows us immediately to be placed in Jude's perspective of the most important person in his life, right? Because his parents are gone, right? His parents are gone. He's being raised by his aunt, who's kind of mean to him. He's not attached to anybody. He doesn't seem to have any good friends or siblings. So it is the schoolmaster who he identifies with. That's good. Any other thoughts about what the effect is or why we might begin with Phillotson?
I was wondering if it's because that's where what he identifies with, that's what he wants to be.
Yes.
He wants to go with him as well.
Yeah, it's funny. His aunt suggests that he goes with him too because she wants to be rid of him. It's too bad he couldn't have taken you. And it's like, Jude's like, what, are you crazy? You can't just ask somebody to take me. I'm not like a piece of furniture. I'm not like a cottage piano, you know, but he would have liked that, I'm sure. But I think you're right. I think that there's a kind of identification. I've often wondered about this name and wondered, because he plays a lot of names. He plays games with names, as you can see. You get a character named Sue Brideshead, and you're like, oh, please, right? You know, there's a lot of like little kind of jokes with names, I think. And I wonder if it's connected to this word, Philistine, which is a kind of, initially it was one of the tribes of Israel. But in the New Testament, it became clear that Philistines were people who had made a show of something, but didn't really follow through with it. So is Phillotson somebody who makes a show of wanting to be a great intellectual, but doesn't actually stay up late reading the books and doing the way Jude is trying to do, right? In a weird way, Jude is a more pure scholar than Phillotson, because he really tries to read all this stuff. And Phillotson obviously had some advantages. You can imagine that what they wanted for the school master in that village was not somebody who had grand designs to go after Christminster, but somebody who would just teach basic, teach the Bible, teach, you know, the basic texts, not to try to like get the kids' heads filled up with fancy ideas. You see what I mean? That they actually probably were, at least the rector was glad to see him go and get some new schoolmaster. And you notice that Jude doesn't fall in love with the new schoolmaster. Did you also get did you get it that he was a night scholar, a night school? So that means that he didn't go to school with the other boys and girls. He was working every day to earn money for his aunts. And so he at night would go to try to learn. I don't know if Phillotson, if this was something that where Phillotson got a few extra, you know, a little bit of extra money for it or what, but that's the way he came to know Phillotson. All right. And again, this kind of idea of the disciples, the other kids are like the disciples standing farther off, and Jude in a weird way is like, I don't know the biblical story well enough, but like a Mary figure, or somebody who doesn't, you know, who goes right to and asks for what he wants, right? All right. Okay, so I want to jump ahead then. So we find, I want to go to the next sort of section, which is chapter 2 of book 1, and I want to sort of start to understand who Jude is, right? So we find out that in fact Sue was born in the same house where Jude was living, and he kept this way in his back of his mind. It's strange. Jude is a kind of person who doesn't seem to, he notices things and then they register in some way, but he's kind of abstracted. He's a little bit of a dreamer, a daydreamer, and he doesn't really, whereas Sue is very, very sharp and on point. So let's go ahead and I'm not at chapter 2 of book 1. I'm sorry, that's where you see Mrs. Frawley. I'm a little further along still in chapter 1. I'm going to read from my book. It's easier for me. I make a lot of mistakes when I try to read off the screen. I'm still in chapter 1 of part the first. Oh, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. I'm in chapter 2. I apologize. This is when This is when the farmer, so Jude's job, as you know, is to be a scarecrow. He runs through the cornfields with this clacker, making this noise whenever he sees birds coming to eat the corn with this clacker, making this loud noise to scare the birds away. And that's his only job. But then at some point, it's on my page 15, he says to them, you know, or actually 14, you know, poor little dears, you shall have some dinner, you shall. There is enough for us all, right? So this idea that there is enough for us all is a kind of egalitarian idea. This is Jude to the birds, right? But it might just as well be Jude speaking, or some part of Jude speaking to the whole society, right? Why are some people in these, you know, why do some people live in these fancy houses and I live in this cottage with my aunt and, you know, live this really hard Scrabble life? Why can't I go and study at Christminster? Isn't there enough for us all, right? So I think it's a very interesting thing for one of the first things that he does. He has this heart, right, that acts, he breaks the rules, but he breaks the rules in a certain way. So is anybody here, like, I'm assuming that quite a few of you are Christians, and I remember when I first read the New Testament, I was not a young person because I'm not a Christian. I didn't grow up with any religion really, but I was shocked by how often Jesus breaks the rules. Like they say, oh, you can't heal people on the Sabbath. And Jesus says, oh yeah, I can, right? Because there's a higher good here. And so I think that, I'm not saying Jude is Jesus or anything like that, but I think that Jude in a certain way is following that logic. Like he breaks the rules, but he breaks the rules for a higher reason, or for what he believes to be a higher reason. Okay. Okay, let's read this section, which is on my page 16. He sees these earthworms that are in his way as he's walking back after he's lost his job. He's probably very unhappy, not only because he just got a whipping, but and lost his job, but he has to go home and tell his aunt, excuse me, that he's lost his job. Though Farmer Troutham had just hurt him, he was a boy who could not himself bear to hurt anything. He had never brought home a nest of young birds without lying awake in misery half the night after, and often reinstating them and the nest in their original place the next morning. He could scarcely bear to see trees cut down or lopped from a fancy that had hurt them, and late pruning when the sap was up and the tree bled profusely had been a positive grief for him in his infancy. This weakness of character, as it might be called, suggested that he was the sort of man who was born to ache a good deal before the fall of the curtain upon his unnecessary life should signify that all was well with him again. He carefully picked his way on tiptoe among the earthworms without killing a single one. I love this little passage here because the narrator seems to be giving us a view of Jude as somebody who is destined to suffer, as he is. But also as Jude is somebody who, as I said, remember John Clare in his poems, if you remember poems like The Mouse's Nest, or even I don't think we read some of the other ones. There's a poem called The Badger, where John Clare identifies with the animals and their suffering. And this happens with with Jude. And so I think this idea that, and by the way, did you know that it is true that if you cut a plant, or even the grass, it screams out? Scientists tell us now that when you cut the grass, it makes this noise. I know this sounds crazy, but I read it. I believed it. It was in something like Scientific American, so I didn't think I was like crazy. And when they try, the best the scientists can figure out is that the noise is like the same thing that would happen as if you were hurt, like crying out to others, in pain. Okay. Don't know. I think that's anyway. So Jude was right. He was ahead of his time. Okay. So after he goes back and tells his aunt that he has lost his job because he let the birds eat whatever they wanted to eat, we get this passage, which I think is really also very beautiful. It's on my page 17. And by the way, right before that, in chapter 1, we get that we get a foreshadowing that Sue and Jude are very much alike, that they both live with their heads in books. So I forgot to mention that earlier, but I think it's important. It's a sort of foreshadowing. Okay. Jude went out, and feeling more than ever his existence to be an undemanded one, he lay down on his back on a heap of litter near the pigsty. The fog had by that time become more translucent, and the position of the sun could be seen through it. He pulled his straw hat over his face and peered through the interstices of the plating at the white brightness vaguely reflecting. Growing up brought responsibilities, he found. Events did not rhyme quite as he had thought. Nature's logic was too horrid for him to care for. That mercy towards one set of creatures was cruelty towards another sickened his sense of harmony. As you got older and felt yourself to be the center of your time and not at a point in its circumference, as you had felt when you were little, you were seized with a sort of shuddering he perceived. All around you, there seemed to be something glaring, garish, rattling, and the noises and glares hit upon the little cell called your life and shook it, warped it. This is beautiful writing on the one hand, but I also want to say that I want to remind you of a line from The Darkling Thrush that goes, tangled, bind stems, scored the sky. So in his journals, he wrote about being a little boy and laying down on the grass, just like Jude. And what would happen is that he would put his hat over his face and look up through what he calls the interstices at the sky. So there's something standing in between him and the sky, and he would view the sky through these little things. Do you know what I mean in a straw hat? How sometimes there are these little breaks in it, like it's woven. So if you put a straw hat over your face, you can see the sun through those little things. And I think that this is kind of maybe a metaphor for the way Jude sees the world, always through these things in his way, these mediators, right? So what are the names of some of these mediators, these things that stand between him and direct experience? They might be class. They might be his nature, right? Which is that he's kind of innocent, right? And the world is not always kind to innocence, we know. Nature's logic is too horrid, right? His feelings, all these things are things that stand in the way of him being able to get at whatever it is, his happiness or something like that. All right, so any questions? So far, I think we're getting to see who Jude is even at 11 years old. This dreamy young kid who wants nothing more than to follow his schoolmaster and become a scholar and to learn, and who loves nothing more than harmony, equality, fairness, things that the world doesn't offer, right? This, as I put here, we're going to read Darwin in this section on Jude, and I think it makes complete sense. So Charles Darwin, argues that nature develops in this kind of what he calls a contingent way. It develops almost by accident, and those creatures that are most capable of surviving that change are those who continue, and those species that are not able to sustain this change perish and go extinct. And this then led to something in the later 19th, early 20th century called social Darwinism, right? Where people said, well, some people are just not strong enough to survive, I found this hard to believe, because people are not a different species. Poor people are, and that seems problematic, but also because, anyway, so it doesn't matter why. But anyway, that this hurts Jude too. Unfairness hurts Jude. Suffering hurts Jude. And all of these things become like things he has to look through in order to see the world. So I'm going to jump ahead. And any questions, though, so far about Jude or about his character or about this novel? No? Okay. I'm glad it's pretty straightforward. Has anybody read Charles Dickens' Great Expectations? You should read it. It's a great novel, and not a super long one, not like Bleak House or one of Dickens' ginormous novels, but the character of Pip is very very similar in some ways, I think, to Jude. Not as fleshed out. I think Jude is almost a stronger character, but anyway, okay. I want to get to Jude's feeling for Christminster, and then talk a little bit about Arabella, and then that'll be it for today. But you're going to have to really just jump on your reading. I'm sorry, but there's just a lot of reading. So I found a audio version of the book on something called LibriVox. Let me put it here in the chat. Megan, the answer to your question, yes. Noah, if you have questions about the grade, please email me and we'll set up an appointment. And Megan, I did record the class on March 11th. I just haven't had a chance to put it up on Carmen yet. So I'm going to put in the chat LibriVox. Now, I do not think you can just get by only listening. But if you listen and read, it might help, right? I find that helpful sometimes, especially with, right? So LibriVox, which you can get for your phone or whatever, it's free. And I think you want version 2 of Jude the Obscure. So, you know, when I used to live in a different state and drive back and forth, I would often listen to the novels I was teaching, not because I didn't know them, but just I would be reminded of scenes. I would be in the feeling of the whole novel, right? And then I come back and, you know, mark up my text and all that and think about it. All right, so any questions then about that? All right, let's keep going then. All right, so the section I want to talk about is after he sort of, after he starts thinking about Christminster, he gets this vision, right? And he's able to climb up on this house, a house that people are working on building. He climbs up on the house, and he'd go out and just like stare out in the direction of Christminster. So I'm trying to find out where it is. Somebody know, is it on? I should have it marked. Must be in chapter. I want to give you the correct chapter. I'll find it and I'll mark it on here.
In my book, it's on page 21.
On page 21? Okay. Oh, yes, you're right. Absolutely. Yes, on mine too. Okay, so that is part the first chapter 3. Thank you so much. In sad, wet seasons, it's at the top of 21 on mine. In sad, wet seasons, though he knew it must rain in Christminster too, he could hardly believe that it rained so drearily there. Whenever he could get away, you know, he'd get up on the brown house, strain his eyes persistently, sometimes to be rewarded by the sight of a dome or a spire, at other times by a little smoke, which in his estimate had some of the mysticism of incense. Then the day came when it suddenly occurred to him that if he ascended to the point of view after dark, or possibly went a mile or two further, he would see the night lights of the city. It would be necessary to come back alone. So the night lights here would probably be gas lighting, not electric lighting. Do you know the difference? So it used to be that you would run gas through pipes and it would fire, right? So it would create quite a bit of light, but it was also very dirty. He was rewarded, but what he saw was not the lamps in a row as he had half expected. No individual light was visible, only a halo or a glow fog overarching the place, against which black heavens behind it, the black heavens behind it, making the light and the city seem distant but a mile or so instead of 20 miles. He set himself to wonder on what exact point in the glow where the schoolmaster might be, he who had never communicated with anybody in Marygreen right now. He's speaking of Phillotson, of course, who was as if dead to them there. Here, in the glow, he seemed to see Phillotson promenading at ease like one of the forms in Nebuchadnezzar's furnace. He had heard that breezes traveled at the rate of 10 miles an hour, and the fact now came into his mind. This is crazy because breezes travel all different miles an hour, depends how fast the wind is blowing. But anyway, that's interesting. He parted his lips as he faced northeast and drew in the wind as if it were a sweet liqueur. You, he said, addressing the breeze caressingly, were in Christminster City between 1 and 2 hours ago, floating among the streets, pulling round the weathercocks, touching Mr. Phillinson's face, being breathed by him, and now you are here, breathed by me, you the very same. Okay, so I just want to sort of like say a couple things about this, and that is this, that Hardy often seems to Hardy spatializes relationships. In other words, if this is here and this is here, what lays between is desire, right? And they are not available to one another, right? The desire, it's kind of like the desire perpetuates. He does this all the time. Jude is thinking where Sue is at one point. Sue is thinking where Jude is at one point. He imagines where Mr. Phillotson is. Everything is kind of located in space. And in fact, many of Thomas Hardy's novels begin with a map that show you the dimensions, so you can imagine for yourself when they travel from place to place. And he spatializes these relationships. That's all I really wanted to say about it. I think it's a wonderful way to talk about the impossibility of getting what it is you truly desire. It's always sort of put off somehow, and there's always some distance that keeps you from it. If it's not the interstices of the hat, and remember, he does this twice in our short reading. The hat happens 2 times. First, when his aunt says you should leave, you should go to, I wish you had gone to Christminster. And then when he realizes that translation means learning entire rules and vocabularies. That's a horrible understanding. I think this is really moving. You know, he thinks that there's just a formula like math that you could put an English word into. He anticipated Google Translate, but you know, he didn't realize he would have to do this. And when he does it, he throws the book down and looks through the interstices of his hat again. This happens at the end of chapter 4. Right. So I'll put that in there just so you have the marking. Okay. All right, so between chapters 4 and 5, several years pass. So I think he's like 17 or 18. It's just 3 or 4 succeeding years. yeah, I'm not sure. Because later he's 20. So let's just say several years pass. I'm not sure exactly how long. Anyways, marriageable age, he's like 16, 17. He's learned to trade. And he's started to get some books and he's starting to read. And so I want to talk about the scene where he first encounters Sue, and this is chapter 6, and this is the part with the pig penis. So so he is in the lane. He's so much of this novel, all the novel, but especially the first part, happens as he's walking on the road, right? So one of the things to know about these roads, by the way, where he is, these are old Roman roads, people. These are roads that were built by the Romans when they invaded, and they're still left standing. So that's 1066, the Norman conquest, right? They're still standing, and these are the roads they walk up and down. It's it's a place where not a lot has changed. Modernity did not arrive in the 18th century, excuse me, the 19th century, to that part of England until quite late. When Hardy returned and built his house, it was like a big mansion, although it was low-key ugly, people say, but even though he was an architect and they didn't like the way it looked. But anyway, so much happens on the roads. So Jude is standing on the road and he is lost in a daydream and in his reading. And in the midst of this, this lostness, he doesn't even overhear these girls, and they throw, Arabella throws and hits him with this pig's penis, which is the best, the most Arabella thing ever, right? And really sets up this kind of relationship between the two. And Jude is suddenly made aware of women. So I'm interested in, I'll read the scenes, okay? These are my pages, 34 and 33, they're in chapter 6. In his deep concentration on these transactions of the future, and he's thinking about being at Christminster, right? And becoming, no, it's too much to think that I'll become a bishop, so maybe I'll just become this or whatever, Jude's walk had slackened, and he was now standing quite still, looking at the ground as though the future were thrown thereupon by a magic lantern. On a sudden, a magic lantern is one of those things that is behind and you get the shadows on the front, like throwing shadows on a wall. That's what it is. On a sudden, something smacked him sharply in the ear, and he became aware of a soft, cold substance had been flung at him and had fallen at his feet. A glance told him what it was, a piece of flesh, the characteristic part of a barrow pig, which the countrymen used for greasing their boots, as it was useless for any other purpose. Pigs were rather plentiful hereabout, being bred and fattened in large numbers in certain parts of North Wessex. And then he goes and confronts the girls who threw it. No one wants to admit it. And then finally he notices Arabella, and he sort of then goes, and says, okay, I'll meet you over on this bridge. And the exchange of the pig's penis it happens, okay? So she whom he addressed was a fine, dark-eyed girl, not exactly handsome, but capable of passing as such at a little distance, despite some coarseness of skin and fiber. She had a round and prominent bosom, full lips, perfect teeth, and the rich complexion of a cochin hen's egg. And this cochin hen's egg, this comes up later, right, in the text, right in the scene that precedes them, I think the first time that they that they are intimate together. She was a complete and substantial female animal, no more, no less. This is so different than the way Sue is described, right? So it's pretty obvious that Jude, that Hardy is being incredibly just direct here, right? And Jude was almost certain that to her was attributable the enterprise of attracting his attention from dreams and humaner letters to what was simmering in the minds around him. So Jude was certain that it was her that had done this, but also that she had what it took to pull him out. All right. So I want to go back up to this before I stop for the day. So I'm not going to go over this plot twist because to me it doesn't seem very important to the novel, although Arabella will return. So don't think you've seen the last of her just because she's gone off to Australia. She becomes an important sort of figure in the novel. But what I want to sort of suggest to you is that so just right, they marry, she tricks him into marriage. I really want you to pay attention when you're reading or go back over this section of the killing of the pig, because this is an example where what Jude does is he knows that if he kills the pig and the pig dies slowly, the meat will taste better and there will be more blood to use in other things they can sell for money. But he cannot stand to allow the animal to suffer anymore. So he does it very quickly. And I guess what I'm saying is that Jude is not practical. He is a dreamer. He is impractical. And this impracticality is based on his character as somebody who is bound to suffer because he cannot accept. There's a great line in a poem by Robert Haas about the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz, and he says, you, my friend, never accepted the world, could not accept the cruelty at the heart of things. The cruelty at the heart of things. And it seems to me that Jude cannot accept the cruelty at the heart of things. And this is one of the problems for him. So I drew this little map for you because I was, or whatever it is, schema, this little thing. And what I want to sort of suggest to you is that when he meets Arabella, he's suddenly aware of his body in a way that he kind of hadn't been before. I mean, he probably had been, but it just didn't really become. And in a certain sense, this causes in him a split where the body is at Mary Green and the soul is at Christminster, books and everything. But in a certain sense, it's biological. It's like his attraction to Arabella. And I wrote here that internal locations and geometries have corresponding exterior locations, which is sort of like what I was saying to you earlier. I wrote this yesterday when I was thinking about teaching today, because honestly, I haven't taught this text, oh my God, in 10 years. So it's exciting for me to be back with it. But I guess what I want to sort of say is that the reason it's so hard for him to be with Arabella is that in order to be with Arabella, he must choose. Let me put it this way, soul and body. So he gives up his soul in order to be bodily there with her. This is a little bit, I'm saying this a little bit too on the nose. I think it's a little more nuanced than this. But I think that when he's able to be with Sue, he doesn't have to make that choice. And there's like a different choice with Sue, still a choice that he has to make, which is to either live by the rules of the world or to live by the rules of his heart. So if you see there are different kinds of pressures. But in either case, he's divided. And again, there's interstices, those like those mediating factors that don't allow him to be there with her. Okay, so we're right at the end after he decides to go to Christminster. He's become a stonemason, and which will be sort of his job, specifically restorer of churches, which is something that Hardy took a lot of interest in. Old medieval churches. And that's, I think, where we are. So does anybody have any questions? Okay, good. So I will see you on Thursday. Read. And if you have any questions, just contact me. Otherwise, I will see you soon. All right, bye.